Okay, so the chemical basis of life. So we're saying here that knowledge of chemistry is essential for understanding organisms and how they function. And so this is something that we sometimes don't spend enough time appreciating. The fact that knowledge of chemistry is essential for us understanding how we function, and there it's been proven that there are chemical similarities amongst all organisms that provide evidence for the evolution of all organisms from a common ancestor. And so, again, we talked a little bit about evolution and this notion that we all evolve and change over time due to those genetic changes in our DNA. And there has been, the studies over time have shown that there are sort of conserved chemical similarities across all living things that lends credence to the fact that we all originated from a single common ancestor. All right. And so we're going to take a look today at some big ideas that help us to understand the connection between chemistry and life. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about elements, atoms, and compounds. You can jot these big ideas down in your notes. And so living organisms are made of atoms of certain elements that are mostly combined into compounds. And we're going to take a look at that relationship today between atoms, elements, and compounds and how they play a role in our lives. We're going to take a look at the formation of chemical bonds. Again, these bonds are created when atoms of different elements interact together. Okay, and so the structure of an atom, okay, determines what types of bonds it can form with other atoms, right? And so these chemical bonds are important when we consider these compounds being formed. There are a number of compounds that we interact with on a day-to-day basis that we require, compounds and molecules that our bodies require, and these chemical bonds allow for the formation of these compounds to be made. Okay. And then lastly, we're going to look at water. We know that water is an essential nutrients or substance or molecule that our bodies require, all living things require. We know our cells, right? We are made up of cells. Our cells are, over 70% water. So we're going to take a look at this very special molecule and some of the unique properties that it contains and how the roles that it play in sustaining life. Okay. So we have a couple learning objectives. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to do 3 things. That's 1, identify and name the function of the principal elements in living things. So there are 4 major elements that we're going to highlight today. You should be able to name and identify those elements. Okay, these 4 elements are going to be found in all living things. All right, you should know what they are. You should know what their role is.
I don't got no presentation.
Please mute your mics for me. All right. You should also, by the end of this lesson, be able to distinguish between an atom and an element. All right. We're going to see here shortly that atoms make up elements. All right. So you'll be able to describe that relationship. And then lastly, when we're looking at these elements on the periodic table, we should be able to also derive some information from that. And those information are the atomic number and the atomic mass. So we're going to look at how we can decipher what those are and what they tell us about the element. Okay, so here goes. So we're talking about chemistry, right? And so we'll start our conversation off and ask, what is matter? When you hear the word matter, what comes to mind? What's your definition of matter? Anyone?
It's tangible. You could touch it. It's visible.
It's visible. Okay. What else?
I think it has a weight to it.
It has to have weight. So we just hit on the 2 main properties of matter. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So everything around us is matter, right? We're made up of matter, of atoms, of elements, right? So anything that has mass and takes up space, okay? Anything that has mass and takes up space is matter. We know that matter can exist in various forms. It could be solid, it could be a liquid, it could be a gas, depending on what the substance is. And so we're going to take a look today at how these matter, these pieces of matter, are essentially the building blocks for all things, right? And so we're talking about life. So we're looking at organisms and what their composition are, right? So organisms are composed of elements, right? So that periodic table that I know you've seen before in your biology class, in your chemistry, you've seen the periodic table before, right? So we are composed of elements that interact or combine into compounds, okay? So living organisms are composed of matter. Okay, matter is made up of chemical elements. And so we're appreciating the fact that today, of those periodic table elements that you've seen before, I think there are about 118 or so chemical elements on the periodic table. About 25 of those are essential for human life. Okay, make a note of that. But of those 25, 4 of them, we're going to look at the great 4. 4 of them make up about 96% of our weight of most living things, okay? And so we want to pay careful attention to those 4 today and appreciate the 4 chemical elements that make up the majority of the mass of living things, right? And so we're saying that those elements, they typically the atoms of elements interact together to form compounds, right? And so we're going to look at a compound, and a compound by definition is a substance that contains 2 or more different elements in a fixed ratio, okay? Write that definition down. We want, when you hear the term compound, I want you to understand that we're talking about an assembly of atoms from different elements in a fixed ratio, and that concept makes sense, and it matters. This isn't a random association of atoms of elements, but they're in a fixed ratio. And the first molecule that just comes to mind is water, right? What's the chemical formula for water?
H2O.
H2O. So that tells us what 2 elements are making up this molecule.
Hydrogen and 2 oxygens.
Hydrogen, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, right? And so that is a fixed ratio. A single water molecule will always have that chemical formula, H2O. There will always be 2 hydrogens and there will always be 1 oxygen in a single water molecule. That's a ratio of 2 to 1. So we'll look at that a little bit more. So anyway, there's different types of matter. Again, there's matter all around us. Anything that has mass takes up space. So rocks that you see outside, air that we breathe, you as students. These are all types of matter that are composed of chemical elements. All right. So let's talk about the chemical element just a little bit. I have here down in this right-hand corner a little snap of the periodic table. I'm sure you've seen the periodic table before, all right? By definition, we're gonna define the chemical element as the simplest form of a substance, okay, that cannot be broken down any further, cannot be broken down into any other substance, okay? So it's the purest, simplest form of a single substance. That's what the element is. All right. Elements are represented on the periodic table by a chemical symbol. All right. If we look here, we have the element calcium. You've heard about calcium before. This is a very important nutrient in our diet. Chemical symbols represent the name of a chemical element, and they're typically 1 or 2 letters. Oftentimes, those 1 or 2 letters are going to be the first or second letters of how to spell the name of that element. But in some cases, the chemical symbol does not align with how with the name of that element is, and it's a little different. All right, can we think of any elements on the periodic table where the chemical symbol is not the first letter of the name of that element?
Potassium.
Salt, silver.
Salt. Yep. Salt, Na.
Potassium.
Silver is what? Ag. Gold. What else? What are some others where the chemical center?
Platinum.
Potassium.
Potassium, K. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, I don't expect you to memorize the periodic table for the purposes of this course, but when we take a quiz or an exam, and then, you know, if I'm asking you some question and you need the periodic table to answer it, I would give you a copy of the periodic table, but you would need to know how to use it depending on what the question is asking you. So anyway, the point we're making here is that the periodic table are arranged in such a way that elements that have similar properties, if you will, similar reactivities, they're aligned. You know, you've got rows and then you've got columns. Columns are vertical, rows are horizontal. And so elements that have the same chemical properties are arranged in the same vertical columns. All right, and they typically react the same. And so, okay, here, so I have a image of the periodic table here. Is a very generic image, and you can see how it's arranged, and depending on the various properties that these elements represent, we arrange them accordingly. There are, at the time that I made this lecture, this could have changed by now, 118 chemical elements on the periodic table. I did not update this last night or remember to make sure this hasn't changed. I'm not a chemist, and I know things are, you know, constantly being discovered daily, but at the time that I made this, there were 118 chemical elements on the periodic table. Only about 92 of those occur naturally or appear in nature. So some of those are synthetically formed chemical elements. But the point we're making here today is that only about 4 of those are making up the majority of the mass of living things, right? And so we care about those 4, okay? Write these down in your notes. The 4 most abundant elements found in living things are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. You need to be intimately familiar with these 4. The acronym is CHON. This is how I remember it. Whenever I think chemical elements and living things, I always think CHON, C-H-O-N, C-H-O-N. You can create whatever mnemonic that you need to remember this, but I always try and remember CHON, okay? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. These are the 4 most abundant elements found in living things, and they make up almost 96, 97% of our total body mass. Okay. Let's look at some of these elements that are in abundance in humans. Carbon. We know that carbon forms the backbone of all organic molecules. All living things are going to contain carbon. All organic substances are going to be made from carbon. All right. That's endless. It doesn't change. All right. Hydrogen, mostly we're going to see these hydrogen molecules in things like water. We know that water is super important for living things, particularly in humans. We require water for transport of nutrients, for moving waste, lubricating organs, regulating body temperature. So all of these things that help to sort of maintain that homeostatic environment that we talked about the other day, making sure things happen the way that they should. Water plays a key role in making sure all of these things happen the way that they should in our bodies. All right, we talked about the systems and so forth, or I think we may have talked about them. But the chemical reactions that are going on in our bodies, I know we talked a little bit about that. Metabolism, digestion, all of those things require water. All right, so we're going to find those hydrogen molecules in water. All right, our bodies are mostly made up of water. We know that. Oxygen, put a big asterisk by oxygen. Oxygen is going to be the most abundant element found in living things. Okay, it's a very important reactant in cellular respiration. Okay, cellular respiration is the process in which we break down the foods that we eat in order to get energy. Write that down if you haven't written that down before. All right. cellular respiration. Okay, oxygen, we need oxygen in order for cellular respiration to take place. So we're breathing in oxygen, right? We require oxygen in order to survive. That oxygen is a key component in cellular respiration. Okay, cellular respiration is how we get the energy that we need to fuel all of our processes. All right, nitrogen. Nitrogen is required for proteins. Why are proteins important? All right, proteins are important because they are the functional units of our cells, right? We're made up of cells, right? These cells all get their functions based on the protein expression profile at any given time. So we need synthesis of proteins to take place, all right? We're gonna see that nitrogen is a key component when we're looking at these amino acid side chains. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Nitrogen is a key component there, right? So nitrogen play a hard role in proteins being made or required for proteins. You find nitrogen also in the nucleic acids, which are the DNA and RNA that our bodies need, right? We talked about DNA being our template for genes being produced. There's an exchange of nitrogen gases in our lungs. Nitrogen is certainly one of the important elements in living things. Do take some time to go back through your OpenStax. I'll give you some OpenStax reading assignments this afternoon to tell you what chapter this corresponds with, because it's not the same textbook. So it may not be chapter 2, as I mentioned before. So those are some elements that are in abundance, CHON. Now, there's another set of elements that we care about, and we call those trace elements. Write this down. Trace elements are those elements that are required in very minute amounts, very small amounts in plants and animals. So living things require these trace elements, but not in large amounts, okay? But they are essential, okay? So some examples of trace elements are iodine, manganese, copper. These are all essential to humans or plants and animals in a very small amounts, but we do need them. What questions do we have? Any questions?
Do we need a book for this class?
There's an open, there's a free online textbook for this course. Does that answer the question? It's available to you. I think you, in my opinion, you can do fine without a book if you are on all of the live sessions and take notes and do the things that I'm asking you to do. But if you would like to supplement that, there is a free online textbook that's posted in your Blackboard course for reading purposes. And it'll help you fill in your notes if there are any gaps or anything like that. Okay. Okay, so trace elements. Again, these are commonly found as additives in our foods and water and other substances that we may come in contact with. Some trace elements are used or required to prevent diseases, right? So for example, you may know that fluoride is usually added to municipal water sources and dental products in order to help prevent or reduce tooth decay and prevent cavities. Did you guys know that? You know that your tap water at home is fortified with fluoride. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yes. And so
Which
we
is
also,
not good.
excuse me?
I said, which is not good at all.
Well, there's good and evil in it, right? And
the good is because it keep your teeth nice. The bad is because you're not supposed to swallow it.
well, right. There's good and bad to a lot of things, but I don't think it's enough to actually be harmful. I think the benefits outweigh the risk, especially when you consider socioeconomics and people who aren't able to afford other dental products and dental care and so forth. It kind of helps give them access to something that they wouldn't ordinarily have access to. So there's good and bad in a lot of things, but I think it's a good thing. All right. some trace elements are added to our food to help preserve the food, to make it more nutritious, to make it look better. And so we try to exploit these properties of elements for our benefit and not for harm. Okay. And so we do use them. And so they are required. They do have minerals and nutrients that we need for a healthy diet. And so they can be added in useful amounts to foods that we eat and preservation and so forth. All right, this is just an image that for those of us that are visual, I like to try to give a visual that, and that's what this picture does for us. Living organisms are made of atoms of certain elements. And so those 4 elements that we talked about here, this first over half of his body is red, and this represents which element? And this is just a illustration for percentage wise, not location. Which element is represented here in red?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. We said that oxygen is the most abundant chemical element in our body. So we just visualize that as a percentage. And then what is this dark gray representing?
Carbon.
Dark gray, yes, carbon. All right. What is this light gray representing?
Hydrogen.
Hydrogen. And then this blue is representing?
Nitrogen.
Nitrogen. All right. And so this is just, again, a visual to kind of paint that picture of the availability of these elements in living things. Okay. We're mostly made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Okay. So that's just a visual. All right. Let's extend the conversation a little bit and look to see how we use these elements to make compounds. Before we do that, I want to take a dive inside of an element. Okay. Elements are made up of atoms, right? So an atom, by definition, is the smallest portion of an element that retains its chemical properties. So picture with me, if you will, if we had a bowl, like a mortar and pestle, right? And we put an element inside and we crushed it up. An atom is going to be the smallest piece of that crushed up element, right? That still retains the chemical properties of that element. The smallest, tiniest piece that you can imagine. And it still retains those chemical properties. And so that's important because remember we said different elements have different chemical properties. And so if we look then at the structure of the atom, we see inside of that these tiny pieces of matter that we call subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are these tiny pieces of matter that make up an atom. All right. So I want us to take a moment and look at the structure of the atom. Inside of an atom, there are 3 subatomic particles, and you've heard this before, so this is probably a review for most of you. But there are 3 types of subatomic particles that make up atoms, right? We have protons, neutrons, and electrons. All right. If you take your attention to this picture down here in the bottom right corner, we have an illustration of what the atom looks like, right? We have this circular representation, which is our atom. Okay. Inside of the atom, there's a structure known as the what? What's this right here?
The nucleus.
The nucleus. So inside of the atom, we have the nucleus of the atom. All right. Inside the nucleus, we're going to find 2 types of subatomic particles, protons and neutrons. Write that down. The protons and neutrons are found inside the nucleus of the atom. Okay. Now, outside of that nucleus, again, we're going to find some energy shells, these outer energy levels, where we can also find our electrons. Okay. So you do need to be familiar with the structure of the atom and where these 3 subatomic particles are located. So a little bit more about these subatomic particles. They do have a charge. Okay, they can be charged. All right, protons are positively charged. Write that down. Protons are positively charged. Neutrons are neutral or uncharged. And then electrons are going to be negatively charged. All right, so again, we just have another simple illustration here of what the atom looks like. Inside of the atom, we have this nucleus where we're going to find our protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged, neutrons are neutral. And then out here in these outer energy shells, we're going to find our electrons. Okay, just make a brief note. And I know this isn't chemistry class, but again, we want to understand how things work. Make a brief note that it is these electrons out here in these outer energy shells that are responsible for atoms of different elements interacting together and the formation of these compounds. Okay, so depending on how many valence electrons are out here, that's going to dictate how atoms of different elements interact together. And don't fret, I'm not going to give you too much problems with this. You definitely will learn more about this in your chemistry classes and so forth. But in order for you to understand how or the role that elements play in our life, we kind of need to, you know, backtrack and just look at how elements are made. All right. And that's why we're talking about atoms today. So subatomic particles. So this here represents, oh, we got some questions in the chat. I'm sorry, guys. Oh, for me? Okay, sorry. All right, so the structure of the atom. Let's take a look at the structure of the atom here. This is, again, just another illustration. If you had to identify or label or draw, you should be able to do that in the most, you know, basic sense, where we have our circular structure here that represents the atom. And inside of it, we're gonna have at least the nucleus. You should be able to indicate or label or identify that the nucleus contains two types of subatomic particles, the protons and neutrons. And then in these outer energy shells, we have electrons, negatively charged. All right. All right, what questions do we have about the structure of the atom before we go on and look at some other information that we can find? Okay. So if we were looking at the periodic table, there are different numbers that we would see associated with each element, right? You see some whole numbers, you see some numbers with decimals, you know, you see the chemical symbol of the element. Well, the first piece of information that we can get is the atomic number. Okay, write this down. Every atom has a fixed number of protons in the nucleus, and that number of protons in the nucleus is the atomic number. Okay, the atomic number tells us the number of protons that are in the nucleus of this atom. Now, this number is unique to all elements. Every element has a unique atomic number. And that atomic number sort of defines the element, or it's what we use to identify this element. Okay, so if I asked you some questions, you know, if it's true or false that we can identify an element based on the number of protons in the nucleus, the answer is going to be yes. Okay, again, this atomic number is going to represent the number of protons in the nucleus, and this number is unique for every element. Will have a different number of protons in its nucleus. And so if I asked you a question and I said, which chemical element has 15 protons in the nucleus, right? I would obviously give you a copy of a periodic table. How would you answer that for me?
Look at the atomic number.
You would find the element that has the atomic number of 15. Absolutely. Okay. So make sure you write that down. Okay. That the atomic number determines the identity of that atom or of that element and defines the element. Okay. And another point of distinction, again, when you're looking at the periodic table, you're going to see some whole numbers and you're going to see numbers with decimals. Your atomic number is always going to be that whole number. Okay. Now, because different periodic tables can arrange things differently. Typically, the atomic number is going to be on top of the chemical symbol, but you know, depending on what rendition of the periodic table you're looking at, it may be arranged differently. But your point of reference for the atomic number is that it's going to be a whole number. Okay. And so if I asked you, if we were trying to identify atoms and elements, I could show you a diagram like this, right? And ask you to identify what element is present. I could mark off this part, right? If I white out that this is a carbon atom, how would you be able to identify what element is represented here?
Count the number of protons.
Count the number of protons in the nucleus. That is how we identify an atom. Okay. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I would count 6 protons here, right? They're positively charged. And so I would go over to my periodic table and look for the chemical element with the atomic number 6. Cool. All right. We'll come back to this checkpoint question a little bit later. Atomic mass. This is another piece of information that tells us a little bit about our atoms, right? Atomic mass is derived from adding together the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, okay? Protons plus neutrons determine the atomic mass. Write that down. What is the atomic mass? The mass of an atom is indicating how much matter it contains, all right? The atomic mass is expressed in atomic mass units. Okay, those are the units, all right? And as a point of reference here, our atomic mass can and often does contain a decimal. Okay, so that's one quick way that you can look at the periodic table and distinguish the atomic number from the atomic mass. All right, the atomic mass tells us how much matter this atom contains. All right, how do we calculate it? We add protons plus neutrons. And so you may be required to do some simple arithmetic. I might ask you to identify an atom that has this many protons or this many neutrons, or if I give you the number of protons, you may have to find the number of neutrons. All right, you can do that by doing simple math equations. All right, protons plus neutrons equals atomic mass. So you set that up depending on what information is given to you to find out the number of neutrons or the number of protons, because the atomic mass is going to be there on the periodic table, the number of protons that's going to be there on the periodic table. So depending on what I ask you, you may be required to manipulate a very simple mathematic equation. Any questions? Any questions?
So how does it turn out being a decimal if it's protons plus neutrons?
Wait, say that again?
So how does it turn out, like the atomic mass, how does it turn out being like 12.011 if it's a, so is it like something?
Well, the number can change. Okay, so the number of neutrons can change. Okay, so that's a little bit more chemistry. If there are isotopes, there are different, the number of protons can change. The number of the number of neutrons can change. The proton stays the same, but the number of neutrons in an atom can change depending on the isotope. And there's various, how do I say, variations of the atom present, like an have you ever heard of like radioisotopes?
Yes.
Yes. So the number of neutrons can change and can result in a decimal. Now, for the purpose of this class, what I would expect you to be able to do is use the atomic mass that's on the periodic table. If I asked you to determine the number of neutrons, you would just do atomic mass minus atomic number. That would give you neutrons if I asked you that, right?
Okay.
Yeah. All right. All right, so a couple more checkpoint questions here that you can work on in your notes when I post this, but I want us to not run out of Oh, we're almost out of time. Let me keep going. Chemical reactions. So we talked a little bit about chemical reactions and the fact that our bodies are constantly undergoing chemical reactions. Now, these chemical reactions can be due to the presence of these electrons in the outer energy shells, right? So I mentioned that earlier, that those valence electrons are going to dictate how atoms of different elements interact together. Right, so we're just understanding that the chemical behavior of an atom is determined mostly by those electrons present in those outer energy shells, right? The point I want to make here is the formation of compounds, right? Chemical compounds are made when atoms of different elements combine, right? So in this case, here's water. We have atoms of two different elements, the elements hydrogen and the elements oxygen. All right, these atoms are interacting together and a chemical compound is formed. Write down the I think we got the definition earlier, but we have atoms of different elements combining in a fixed ratio here, and we get this water molecule being made. Two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom. Water is formed. This is an illustration of how you have two elements, right, with very different properties independently. We have sodium, pure sodium, and then we have pure chlorine, right? These elements are very different. They're going to have some very different reactivities independently, right? But when we put these elements together, right, we get a totally different molecule being formed. This compound that's made from sodium and chlorine is going to be a sodium chloride product, which is table salt, a completely different compound with completely different reactivity. Okay, so this is just kind of making that point that these elements, you know, independently are going to have certain reactivities, right? But when we put them together and chemical reactions take place, new products are formed, right? That will also have different reactivities. All right, so let's look at this concept of a chemical reaction. All right, chemical reactions are basically the formation or breaking of chemical bonds, right? There are two components to a chemical reaction. We have reactants and then we have products, right? And so we have chemical equations that represent what's going on in a chemical reaction. Chemical equations represent what's happening in a chemical reaction. The two main components, we have our reactants, okay, which are going to be on our left-hand side of our equation. And these are the substances that are participating in the reaction. Write that down. Our reactants are substances that are participating in the chemical reaction. And our products, which are typically going to be on our right-hand side of our equation, are going to be those substances that are formed as a result of the reaction, right? And so this is an example of a chemical reaction. What chemical reaction does this equation represent? Does anyone recognize it?
Photosynthesis.
This is photosynthesis, okay? Photosynthesis is a very important chemical reaction that plants and some bacteria utilize for the production of food. So the reactants in this equation are carbon dioxide and water, right? In the presence of sunlight energy. And the products that are made are glucose and oxygen, right? We know that plants release oxygen and they make their own foods in the form of glucose, right? So this is a chemical reaction right here that's represented by a chemical equation. Let's stop right here. We'll pick up next class on chemical bonds because I feel like I'm kind of rushing now. What questions do we have about this today?